Gracie.
She's looking right at you. Can't you see her?
Amazon Studios' Them stems from the brilliantly twisted mind of creator-writer Little Marvin. Them is the story of the Emery family, led by actors Deborah Ayerinde and Ashley Thomas, who relocate from rural North Carolina to Compton in the 1950s and are terrified on multiple levels. The family finds themselves plagued by demons, both supernatural and all too human. To tell this story properly, Little Marvin assembled an astounding creative team who all worked closely in collaboration to bring his vision to life. First up, production designer Tom Hammock talks about recreating 1950s-era Compton and the challenges of creating a period-authentic Dutch settlement for a flashback episode.
Before we get started, I have to say you did the production design, I believe, on one of my all-time favorite, most underrated horror movies ever. Really a thriller. It's You're Next. I love that movie. Love that movie.
Me too.
Yeah, it must have been so much fun designing that mansion or working within the confines of that mansion. I assume you didn't build a mansion.
No, we didn't. It was a lot of fun. It was an interesting case where we ended up refurbishing the mansion for an elderly couple so they could move back in, and made a horror film just before we did it. So
yeah, because you tear it up pretty well.
we did.
Excellent. So obviously you have that, you have, now you have Them, but you have other experience in production design for horror movies. What is it about the genre that attracts you to the work?
I think it's just that you can really push the envelope in that genre in a design sense that maybe you can't necessarily within other genres. Right. The horror audience can be so forgiving and really embracing of just like pushing the boundaries on the artistic front. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So flash forwarding to Them, you have several design complications, I would imagine, here in this anthology series, in the first season of the anthology series. So let's start with 1950s Compton. What kind of research did you do to make sure that, which, by the way, complete revelation to me to know that Compton used to be a white neighborhood back in the day, which is really interesting in and of itself. But what kind of research did you do to make sure that you had period-specific details?
Well, we just did a whole lot of, what everyone would do. You start in and you do your internet searches, but also we spent a lot of time purchasing magazines from the time period, catalogs from the time period, home design, architectural digest type things, so that you could not just see the houses as they were being built, but you could see all of the appliances and home decor that, people were being encouraged to buy. And we kind of put that together into this, tried to build out the world. So that was one aspect of it. But then you have this deep underbelly of what's happening, particularly with the banks, and for that, I'd gone through the architecture school at Berkeley, where we touched a lot on redlining during the history of architecture classes. And I actually talked to some friends there about that. And we really tried to delve in to the bank records, to get that specific language in the contracts that the banks were using then. And, little the showrunner, Little Marvin, was really, really careful about this stuff, and to the point that we really went on a deep dive for the original maps. So you could see how these neighborhoods were being divided up, how different communities were being described in the maps, because those maps ultimately, as you see in the title sequence, play such an important role in the backdrop of the story of our Emery family.
Right. So as I look at, there's essentially, if you break down the series, there are essentially two main neighborhood locations. One is Allison Pill's house, and then there's the Emery house. And I have a distinct memory of very different color palettes for both. How did you
It's
decide what
true.
they were, and how are they representative of those characters?
Well, basically, we really just split up our neighborhood between the Caucasian families that were there, and we tried to make the outsides identical for all the houses. So everything was in a pastel color palette for everybody who moved to the neighborhood. And when you came to the Caucasian families, that pastel color palette entered the inside of the house. So Betty's house was blue, other neighbors were pink or cream. And so you're bringing that all the way through. Whereas for our Emery family, you enter through the front door and the house is not their friend. You have this very dark and foreboding color palette, quite overwhelming patterns, greeting them sort of at every turn of the corner. And really, to a certain extent, enhance the horror. And, we can get into it later, but help with the creatures that inhabit their house.
Right. I'm also thinking about Betty's house. When in the first episode, you see her after the Emery family had moved in, she realized who her neighbors were. She comes back inside the house and she notices a little tear in the wallpaper, and she starts peeling away at it. And of course, that wallpaper is all kinds of shades of blue. It's such a perfect metaphor for what's going on at that moment. But in terms of the wallpaper, how difficult was that to find, like, period specific wallpaper that would fit the other designs that you'd created for the interior of these houses?
Totally. We spent so much time on the wallpaper. Honestly, the majority of it we made and printed in-house. Our
Okay.
graphic designer, Carolyn, just spent hours and hours making it. And then the other difficulty we had was because of the low light situation, with working with our cinematographers and our costume designer, that you have these creatures obviously haunting the Emerys, and because their former jobs as school mistress or preacher, they're dressed in black to get separation against the dark backgrounds, so you could see these spiritual entities moving around. We needed to have patterns that would allow them to stand out. So we did a whole lot of camera tests to find the right scale to let our creatures kind of haunt the backgrounds in the corners in black and still be seen in the dark.
Right. Getting more, moving a little bit away from sort of the everyday aspects of these 1950s period designs, then you go toward some of the more challenging moments of this, the non-fantastical moments where you've got the dolls hanging from the front of the Emery's house as when they're being terrorized essentially by the neighborhood. Talk to me about creating those dolls. It must have been very challenging, difficult to go through all of that.
Yeah, those dolls and the other aspects of it were really difficult, but what we tried to do, everything based very, very carefully, as you and I discussed before, on the research. We didn't really go outside the bounds. We always tried to have as very specific photo reference for anything we did in that regard, whether it was things burned in the lawn or those dolls or the Jack-in-the-Box. It was all a recreation of something rather than something dreamed up or expanded, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So it becomes even more horrifying to know that, this is all based in reality. This is not something that the team dreamed up. This is something that actually existed.
Yes, exactly.
Um, so we start the season in the North Carolina location. Well, I'll use North Carolina quotes because I'm actually from North
Yeah.
Carolina, and Chatham County, North Carolina doesn't look anything like that where that was filmed.
No, it doesn't.
But that's okay. When you get to episode 5, you have what I've referred to as the cat in the bag sequence, that horrifying sequence that
Yes.
everybody talks about. This may be a really morbid, weird question, but I was fascinated as to how you created the image or the artifact that became the Emery's son in that bag. And, as they toss the bag around, the blood starts to seep through the burlap or whatever's covering it, the pillowcase. How did you create that?
Well, there are two aspects. There's the pillowcase, which, we spent a long time on that bedding because the pillowcase isn't random. You'll see it in their bed early on, and it transitions down ultimately over the previous 4 episodes, and then into that sequence, laundry. But then effects and props together had made a doll that was in the pillowcase, and then that at a certain point, believe they were able to rupture a blood bag, and then that was enhanced in visual effects based on the staging for Janixa, who was directing that episode. So, I mean, I know it was obviously quite difficult and trying for everybody, that episode, but that's how they achieved that sequence. Is it was largely practical and then a little bit of blood enhancement right in post.
Yeah, it's so horrifying to watch, but it is effective in terms of the overall story and theming they're trying to convey.
It is, yeah.
So moving away from sort of the horrors of the real world to the horrors of the fantasy world, the ghouls that lurk in the background, the rooms that you go to and closets that are converted into just sort of otherly dimensional type places. What was the most challenging of that to create? Because I'm thinking of things like in the finale where Lucky goes into the closet, and then there's that old school room. Things like that, or the theater in the finale as well.
Exactly. Those were really challenging, and not just obviously because they happened at the height of the pandemic,
right?
As we were coming back in, but I think the classroom, which because at the same time we were doing the black and white episode.
Yes.
My art director, Adam Davis, was working on that one. And for that aspect, we actually there were no mirrors in that room. So for the bathroom, so there are no mirrors. The bathroom is built twice as a mirror image of each other. So when you look through the empty hole, you see what would be a reflection. And then at the end, the doorway she enters, you have a revolving set that's rolled out and then rolled back in camera so that you get the direct connection to the house.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If that makes sense. Same with the school room. So you have the school room and then the back wall of the school room, and right next to it, you have the closet, and they roll back and forth so that you can change that back wall in camera, do the camera move. Both of those sequences were shot by Ty West, the horror director, and he's very, very into, doing gags like that in camera, which was a ton of fun for everybody involved to figure out how, you could turn those sets around and just in the blink of an eye, make it become that other space in camera.
You talked about the flashback episode, which was actually my next question. You had to rebuild, or you had to build an entire town, I assume. I mean, and then burn it down.
Yeah. Yeah, we found a backlot in old backlot in New Mexico, and then we basically augmented it heavily. So transforming it into this kind of puritanical Dutch town back from the early days of Los Angeles were very strange with all of these communities that had escaped from other parts of the US and had gone as far west as they could and just kind of ended up here. And this Dutch town was just one of those types of communities that ended up in the Los Angeles basin.
Yeah,
Um,
it's really gorgeous looking.
I'm glad, and it was obviously an interesting design challenge to do that for black and white
Hmm.
when obviously we'd very much been in color mode for the
Right.
whole rest of the series.
Is there, as a production designer, is there a, that set had to be pretty sparse, right? Because these are religious Dutch people. They don't have a lot of flash. They have very practical houses, practical equipment, but there still has to be a sense of how you decorate these things so that they look correct or they look natural in black and white.
Exactly. And I mean, that's part of the challenge is that people did not have a lot of stuff
Right.
back then. So what we did is we tried to make sure all the walls were always very textural, that there were, a lot of windows so that the frame was always filled and always busy, even if what was actually there was fairly Spartan. Um, and then just putting our emphasis into the handful of things that really, really matter, like say the quilting table or the eating benches in the main room, the altar. Those sorts of things kind of get all the lavish and attention from set deck, but it's really just about making sure the frame feels full, even if it's not filled with furnishings.
Right. Does that town sort of come from? I don't know if they have period photographs of that. I mean, I guess I kind of forget what time frame that was, what era that was. I was assuming in the early 1900s.
Yeah, it's that the odd kind of post-Civil War,
Mhm.
pre-World War One era where, they don't make a lot of Westerns in
Right.
that era because it's this sort of fascinating time. The assassination of Jesse James takes place in the same era,
Mhm.
and you have this situation where, like, the architecture's familiar, right? People live in little bungalows, but it's it's very empty and still a bit foreign. And that's really what we tried to get across was this sort of ghost of familiarity about this town where people lived, where you could be on a street now and one of those bungalows might still be there as a back house behind somebody's house. So there was just trying to achieve that level of familiarity with what you were looking at. So it didn't seem that far back, as opposed to, say, a traditional Western town, which probably would have been an easier direction to go in, much less building.
Right.
But everybody was really supportive of trying to take this different tact with what the town could be.
Excellent. Um, then, of course, you've got Betty being kidnapped and placed in a subterranean vault, a panic room, or a bomb shelter. I guess is
Yeah.
what it would have been in the 50s, which is very representative of the 1950s. There were a lot of bomb shelters because the nuclear, the concerns over nuclear holocaust and things like that. I look at that room and I think this is her kidnappers fantasy world. Like this is what his idealized environment would be, and this is what he's created for her. I feel like he's been planning to kidnap her for months and months, maybe years, and that's what he built out to make her happy. Was that the intent? Is that what you intended when you're designing that bomb shelter?
It was, so we basically tried to approach the design in two different parts. So we designed his ideal bomb shelter without her in mind at all,
Okay.
so that you had the poured concrete walls and
Right.
the back room with everything. We were able to find a bunch of stuff from a real bomb shelter that was being sold on eBay. Someone had discovered one and opened it up and was selling the bunk beds that folded up into the walls and that kind of thing, which was a lot of fun. And then we decided, okay, so if this guy was going to retrofit it, now that we have the bomb shelter design, what would he have done? And then that's where you get the bad wallpaper job that's almost her pattern of wallpaper.
Mhm.
And he's recovered the couch down there and found the two end table lamps and really tried to make it her world. So that everybody loved that one set, which was pretty funny that you never know what set's going to become a favorite
Right.
of the crew, but that was one of them.
Next, cinematographer Checco Varese talks about playing with shadows and light to heighten the terror. After all, it's what you can't see that often frightens you the most.
So, as I look at your resume, you have a very strong affinity for sci-fi and horror across your body of work. What have you taken from those previous projects that you then used on them? Is there a certain like a trope or the way that you lens a sci-fi or a horror film that you kind of fell back on as you started on them?
I think so. I don't know why I have such a luck to end up doing horror and sci-fi, because I'm not a horror viewer and I'm not a sci-fi. Yes, of course I read all the books and Aldous Huxley. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, Huxley, and I read everything. But I wasn't like, I'm not your classic fan. I won't run
Mhm.
to the theater to watch a horror movie, and I end up in this world, and I seem to enjoy it, and I seem to do it well. So I guess I don't know. The thing with horror or thriller, not necessarily only horror. It's about what you don't show. It's about
Mhm.
the things you don't show the audience. It's
Right.
like, oh, don't open the piano, don't. And if he opens the piano, it's great because nothing happened. But when he turns, then all of a sudden Clarence is in front of me and kills me. So there are tricks, and there are not tricks. There is a genre language that comes natural to me. I don't know why. And every time you do a show, or every time you do a movie, or every time you do a project, you basically, I try to be a sponge from directors and learn from them, because ultimately they are the ones that set up the pace and set up the dialogue with the camera.
I'm thinking about, you're talking about the things that you don't see. I'm most vividly remembering some of those sequences in the basement of the Emery house where Lucky or the children, there's that shadowy corner of the basement where there may be a giant monster lurking back there, or there may not, or, at some point, I don't ever actually think you see totally everything. There's that corner of the basement is never fully revealed. Like at one point they go back there and they grab a weapon. I'm like, what? Is there a tool shed back there? Like what's going on back there? But that's what makes those scenes so effective, is that you don't see that corner of the basement.
Paraphrasing a master, and I'm a big admirer of his work. Vittorio Storaro says, "I
Mhm.
paint with light."
Yep.
Not to any close stretch of imagination comparing myself to Vittorio or any of his work and bulk of work, but with them, the mantra was trying to paint with shadows, trying to paint with absence of light. The family and the whole show happens in two different environments. One is the reality, where the racism is the horror, and the redlining is the horror, and the other, the other person, them,
Mhm.
it's the horror. And that the approach was to be as, I wouldn't say naturalistic, but as overt and naturalistic as possible. We'll see everything. We'll enjoy every corner of the room. We'll see everything. And when we went to the basement or the creatures or the entities, not the creatures necessarily, the idea was less is more. We don't want to see, and in a great collaboration with the art department or the wardrobe department, the production design or the wardrobe design, Miss Vera, which is this tall teacher that haunts one of the girls or the family itself. The idea was, okay, if there is this shadow you don't see, but there is a wallpaper in the back, and you see the wallpaper sort of transforming because the foreground moves, but you don't see the foreground, you only see the background. But because it's wallpaper, you do sense a movement. And the wardrobe designer gave me this fantastic sort of silk that she bought in India or whatever, that it has a little bit of reflection, and so whatever light was hitting it, you would see something moving, but there was no light hitting them. So it was very interesting to avoid seeing things, and I think that is where the horror lays. You open a dark room and you want to turn the light on because you want to see. It's since the cavemen, we had a fire and a thing and a stick. Or you go to bed and you don't wake up until the next morning, which is what probably we should have all that done.
So you lens the pilot. And you've talked about a couple of things there where playing with the light, the absence of light. But when you sat down with Little Marvin and Nelson Cragg, who directed the pilot, what were some of those concepts that you talked about using in the pilot that could be carried on through the rest of the series?
Little Marvin, it's an extraordinarily brain. It's an extraordinarily creative force. And his forte is to let you make the pitch of what you think. And he will go, no, yes, that's a great idea. So that opens up a whole plethora of tools and tool sets that you can use. And Craig, which is a very experienced cinematographer, a fantastic friend and director, we sat down and started talking about what are the language. We use the anamorphic with a little distortion. We will use a little bit of maybe a Dutch head. When things start taking a little turn, maybe the camera is not perfectly horizontal, there is a Dutch. And we started that dialogue. And I was reading an interview Craig did the other day, and in the interview, somebody asked a question about the reshooting some things. And the truth is, we, due to the generosity or the comprehension of Amazon in the studio, we got to reshoot a few scenes because the tone wasn't right when we shot it the first time, which was right the first time, But once we put it together, we said, oof, this may not be clicking right there, And so that was sort of the dialogue. Little Marvin had this saying, this is a 1950 classic Hollywood movie with a 1970s technique and lensing with and I added and we added with the 1990s music video techniques and craziness, and the 2021 or 2019, the 21st century technology. So it's, if you take those 5 decades and compress them into one element, that's what you get, And it was quite fun, and it was a lot of energy, positive energy put into that.
When I talked to the production designer, Tom Hammock, he talked about using different color palettes for the Emery family versus the others, like the Betty's house, for example, is mostly blue. There's a lot of blue there. There's, those colors are carried through with the white families. Were there any similar shifts in the type of lenses or takes that you used, equipment that you used rather, to film, the Emerys versus the other white families?
Yes. First of all, I want to also pay homage to my colleague and partner, Javier Grovet, which is the other cinematographer that did half of the episodes. we work in a tandem together, and we were saying, okay, what did you do here? I did this. What did you do there? I did that. So to answer your question, the first thing is, a cinematographer is basically the last element that comes to play. You know, you get a fantastic production design and the walls are blue, which we agreed that that was the color. And then you get the wardrobe, and the wardrobe has these tones and matching with the wallpaper in the back. And then you get the actors and the makeup and the hair. And then finally you land and say, okay, all this is mine. What do I do with it? You know, Betty's house was a house that was cold. She is a woman that is constrained by her way of being, by her upbringing. I don't know that. But it's obviously, it's almost like a Quaker, you know, so whatever light was coming through the house was a colder element. And if you want to go into details, it was probably 5,000, 6,000 Kelvin versus the emeries that brought with them the happiness of the rural areas and the hopes that they had, and the sun shines through the windows and creates beautiful shadows. In the case of Betty and the other people, it was a very soft light and very sort of northern light, most European kind of painting light. That was sort of a decision we made. And the Emirates has this sort of yellow mustard kind of beautiful color inside the house that is different than everybody else's, but it also lends to a sort of like a creepy wallpaper, a little bit too over designed wallpaper on purpose. I'm not saying we over designed it, but it was, the concept was that it was like creepy and all those creatures that, so yes, every element was different in the approach.
As you look at filming something like this, I'm just remembering so many scenes from the series. It is emotionally difficult material. It was an emotionally challenging experience for the actors. I talked to Deborah, I talked to Ashley. You know, it's a lot to be able to capture all of those moments on camera. As you as a cinematographer, you're there capturing those performances. You don't obviously want them to have to do it again and again and again to get to those emotional depths. Is there then a pressure on you to get it right that very first time, because you want to avoid them going through? I'm most specifically thinking about like that episode 5 with the cat in the bag sequence. You know, did you feel that challenge to make sure you were getting that moment and getting all of the right angles as quickly as possible?
That's a very good question. I come from a background of documentaries in news. So I was a news cameraman for 14 years and a documentary cameraman for a longer time. You don't get a second chance, right? You know, if you are covering the Bosnian War, it is what it is. I mean, the prime minister is going to say the sentence once. He's not going to repeat it. Or the guy running in the street because he's being chased is going to happen only once. Right. So that's in my DNA. That's who I am. So yes, I could make it better the second time, but the first time is the best possible thing I had at that point. That was it. You know, yes, I could make it better. If the director wants a second time, then I'll change something very quickly. But if not, that's it. Yes, there was pressure. Specifically, when it becomes, when it's about the creatures and the entities, we were very detailed, and it was a very, I wouldn't say slow, because nothing is slow. Even though Amazon was generous, and even though streaming it's generous, we had 12 days to shoot an hour. That's a feature in 24 days. Right. So that's a very small feature. It's an indie feature, 24 days. I mean, Marvel shoots for 150. Right. You know, I've shot It for 100 days. Pacific Rim for 150 days. You know, you're shooting a movie, a 1 hour movie. If you take 2 episodes, it's 24 days. So it's very quick. So you don't have time anyway. But in the creatures, we had a little more time because we were very specific. But when it became with the girls or with like very hard scenes like episode 5, all my background as a documentary filmmaker comes in, and I say, okay, the light comes from this window, comes from that window, and this is your playground, this is the sandbox, you can do whatever you want. And I had a great crew, I had great focus pullers. I operated personally that scene because I thought it was good for Deborah and it was good for everyone. And it also was redeeming for myself because it was, not that I don't trust my operators, but I had to be part of that moment. I had fantastic operators, but sometimes it's easier for me to do it myself. And that was the concept of that scene was, we want to see everything. We want to see as much as possible without seeing everything, obviously, for obvious reasons. So the lighting was a little bit more forgiving, and there were less dark spaces because you wanted this is my opinion and little Marvin opinions too. It's when it comes to creatures, you want to see less. But when it comes to real racism or real events, because these rapes or whatever happen every 2 days in North Carolina, South Carolina, LA, whatever. It was about to seeing it. It wasn't a documentary, but it was the feeling of being able to see as much as Deborah could have seen.
So when you're filming a scene like that, I assume it's one camera, so you film at multiple angles. She has to perform it multiple times, or did you have multiple cameras in that sequence?
That scene in particular starts with one camera with the chase, when she's being chasing and hiding and chasing and hiding. And then when the actual event happened, we had 2, if not 3 cameras.
Okay.
One is the main camera, and then the other one is the other 2 cameras are the cameras that will grab the occasional hand grabbing the carpet or the relaxed hand after the tragedy or the close-up of the eyes, whatever it is, you know. And then once you do it once or twice, hopefully not more than that, then you start dissecting it and you say, okay, it would be great if we just grab this little bit, you know, so please, could you just put your hand down and grab the couch or grab the carpet? Could you just see somebody walking in the shadow? So let me just get the shadow of this person. So you start dissecting the scene. It's a little bit like shooting action, you know, you shoot the master and then you start dissecting.
Right. So you talked about splitting lensing duties for the first season, but you did film the flashback episode, which was Covenant 2. Talk to me about making the choice to film that in black and white. What other cinematic stylized choices did you make?
That was an interesting challenge because little Marvin and myself and the director, Craig, we were dying to do it black and white. Some of the executives were a little bit more skeptic of that. Those supportive but skeptic because they thought it was jarring. You know, you're watching episode 1 through 8, and then all of a sudden this is black and white, and what am I watching? You know, so it was challenging because the mantra was, let's shoot it for black and white, but let's make sure we can do a color pass that pleases everyone. So that for a cinematographer is an extraordinary task, and for everyone, because if you know that it's going to be black and white, then there is no, like in this case, this will look white and this will look black,
right?
As opposed to light blue or your shirt, which is blue, or yeah, that shirt will look dark gray. So the choices, so all of a sudden you start thinking as a cinematographer, okay, what is black, what is not black? So wardrobe helped us. So we shot it at the right time of the day, mostly, you know, with long shadows, elongated shadows. The fire, there is a lot of fire in that place, in that episode. I tried to keep it sort of in exposure. So even in black and white, it wasn't a white ball. It was like, it had life, and the tongues of fire would be a personality or be a character. So it was quite a challenge, but I think the results I'm very pleased with them, and I'm very satisfied with it, because even the fire, which was the greatest challenge, because fire, it's orange, and then everything is like alive and attractive. Now it's black and white. So I watch a lot of documentaries from the First World War and Second World War to sort of understand what is the most challenging, what is the most effective way. And so we use the same lenses, the same cameras, and we just did a pass in black and white, which was the one you see. And we did a pass in a faded color. And the studio loved the black and white, so everybody was happy.
So
happy ending.
Sort of happy ending for the whole series.
I know. The whole series, there's nothing happy about it. Anyway, yeah.
Last question for you. You talked about not being an explicit fan of horror. Does lensing something like this make you more or less likely to watch it?
Well, I don't think them is horror. I think them, it's unfortunately reality, you know, and the creatures and the elements, you know, you could argue that the preacher, it's taking ayahuasca from my country and hallucinating the devil, but he did burn everybody because he pushed the candle and everything burned and everybody died. So you could argue. So I don't know. When I say horror, I think of these movies about people with machetes going around and chopping heads and, you know, slasher. That's not my genre, but like The Sixth Sense, Sixth Sense, not The Fifth Element, The Sixth Sense, the other number. The Sixth Sense, is it horror? It's a thriller. I see dead people. That I adore, and I think it's fantastic. And I think them is the biggest attraction I had to the scripts was that if you take the elements of horror, if you take Miss Vera, if you take the blackface man, and you take the preacher out, it's still an extraordinary piece of writing and piece of television or streaming. It is.
Yes.
I mean, you know, yes, you're missing, so you don't understand what's happening because it's intrinsic, the horror. But that wasn't the thing that attracted me. The thing that attracted me was the reality of what African American family lived through in the 50s or in 2021.
Yeah, I think what little Marvin has referred to it as almost a terror. It is the terror of being Black in 1950s. It is the terror of being Black today. And that's the primary scare out of it. It's not necessarily the supernatural elements. It's about the interpersonal terror that happens, just in the average, everyday, ordinary street scenes.
If you ask me, I think Miss Vera is nicer than the neighbors.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, she's not that bad, compared to the neighbors.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's probably true.
Miss Vera doesn't kill anyone.
No.
It
chokes, but that's it.
Yeah, in a little bit, not that bad.
Right.
But that's to me is what was. And as a cinematographer, it's the terror, the horror, and the suspense. It's what is attractive because of the lack of information and the way you have. And horror or terror, it's like very precise in the way you lens it, in the way you edit it. So that's very attractive to me.
Yeah. Well, Checco, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the work on the series. It's beautiful terror.
Yeah, it
looks
terrific.
Great.
It's terrific. Beautiful. Yeah, it was everybody's work, and I loved it, and I think it's one of my best pieces.
Finally, costume designer Marianne Cheo hails from the world of horror, after having designed for 3 Platinum Dunes horror reboots, including A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. Here she talks about her astounding designs that feature intricate symbolism and subtle details, leading the audience to subconsciously understand more about the characters and the themes of them.
Before we get started talking about them, I have to start with, I was looking over your resume, and I am a huge fan of two movies that you designed costumes for. One was Friday the 13th. The one was Nightmare on Elm Street. What was it like designing costumes and looks for such iconic characters?
It was interesting because we had to, we definitely explored changing like Freddy Krueger's sweater and different colors, and went circled all the way around and came back to the original. It's always a little nerve wracking because they have a huge fan base, so you don't want to disappoint. But it's also quite a good challenge. I grew up, watching those horror movies when I was younger, and so I always, I do like the horror genre. So it was exciting because I'm redoing classics. We did 3 of them with Platinum Dunes, Michael Bay's company at the time. So it was exciting and terrifying at the same time. And all 3 of those costumes are on display when you walk into his office. So every time I go in there, I'm always kind of excited that they're there. It was interesting. It was fun.
I can imagine. So moving on to them, what kind of early conversations did you have with little Marvin and the rest of the team as you were figuring out what this show was going to look like? Well,
there were some specific directives for us to sort of figure out what it meant coming from little Marvin. And one is to make, again, we were all, I think, fans of the horror genre from the period, from the 70s, probably, and the 80s. So, and little Marvin had said he wants it to be, this is, just visually, I think, he wanted it to be like the 70s does the 50s. So, we study, I knew a lot of the movies from that time. So it was, it was tricky in the sense that we didn't want to veer too far from being that it's the 50s. And we wanted to design characters around, how they would dress and have, a real meaningful, conversation with 50s costumes and clothing. But we also wanted to have this kind of flair. And I think it really all came together when the music was put to the project. And, but we did, we like movies like Suspiria and Seconds. So, they have a certain sort of style to them. And so that's sort of what we brought into that. And clothing wise, for like Lucky, because of the 40s, it was the late 40s, it was so close from where she came from. And the 70s sort of did the 40s and fashion. So we did a lot of 40s looks for her, which kind of gave it to the sort of 70s vibe to it visually.
So what does that mean? When you look at let's use Lucky's costumes, for example, what designs does that, if I'm as I am a novice in the world of fashion, what does that mean for me? What looks should I look at, specific types of skirts or whatever? Yeah.
So when you look at, if you compare, which is, sort of is what's happening with Lucky's character and Alison Pill's character, it's the black, the white, it's, they're representing, racism, what it means to both of them, really. And so in the costumes, like Alison Pill, she's like on top of a cake at all times. She's got the very 50s silhouette with the crinolines underneath, and she just is like a belle at all times. And then for Lucky, which is very much like was the 40s, is the more straight line. I think she wears really only one true sort of 50s dress, which is a green one that she wears. I think it's in episode 2 or 3. When she goes to the hardware store. But really she's in these silhouettes that are more streamlined. There's not a lot of crinolines underneath it. And it looks they look kind of 70s because in fashion, that's what had happened in the 70s. They took a lot of clothing from the 40s and did it. So it worked for us to have kind of a 70s vibe for her or for the show.
Okay. So when you look at more period specific clothing for the 50s, I know it's the 70s looking back at the 50s, but then you've got, as you've mentioned, Alison Pill's Betty in that sort of crinoline sort of, the bell shaped dress. It must have been irresistible to you to try to, maybe almost not necessarily parody those costumes, but maybe kind of comment on them, but I'm thinking mostly about things like, the milkman, the character of the milkman, and then the milkman outfit. That's such a standard 50s stereotype. Playing with that from the costume perspective must have been fun.
I mean, we just pulled. I'm kind of a purist when we get to doing period clothing. So it's just why when they said the 70s, they sort of describe certain looks, and I said we can't really do that because we have to be able to. I personally would really love to try and stay true to the period as well, but we can do it this way. So, like for the 50s looks, it's really fun to go through when you start researching it, like the milkman dressed like that, right down to the leather bow tie, which we thought was really kind of naughty for his character. But, my sister designer comes in, she's like, look what I have found, and we could see kind of a sheen in the bow ties on them. And a lot of them were made leather. It was part of the uniform or what it was. So it was really fun to do the milkman, straight in that outfit. And, the 50s had definite rules on how people wore things. So, it's like, hats, gloves. There's, definitely like there's like an etiquette book on how to dress, for that period that you can just look up. And we really tried to do that, especially with Alison Hill's character. We might have given, as far as a parody, we may have given her one extra crinoline underneath her skirts to really make them stick out. So we did go there, and it's true for the period. So
great.
And actually, Alison had mentioned in one of her interviews, which I really liked, is that when we got to the scene where she had to undress in front of her husband, she wanted to make sure had everything on everybody underneath what they would normally wear. That's the only way to get the shape to look correctly.
Right.
And I was like, well, do you want to go timing wise? Should we get rid of the waist cincher or one of these things? She's like, oh no. She goes, I want to show it all. So it really shows how she's been caged in. So she had every piece of undergarment on there that she used during the scene. And I thought that was really kind of brilliant to show it, because we have there's subtle references to birds in cages and people in cages, and it's that's also carried through the wardrobe, and in set design too, the birds. So we play through that throughout. So it's just one more thing into that, going and digging deeper to the subliminal sort of signs we were trying to do.
Plus, having so much crinoline under that skirt for her works when you get to the end, and spoiler alert, when she's shot and she falls face down on the grass, that skirt goes flying up. We
all kind of died, and we're inside and outside on that one. We're like, oh my God, it was so great when it happened,
Yeah.
And actually, we had two endings to it, so we never really knew what was going to come up. I was like, is it going to be the crinolines or is it going to be the other ending? So, which is what they chose.
And it's interesting. What's that?
One of them, she got away.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, then, yeah. It's interesting, though, that the bow tie for the milkman is leather, because, I didn't know that was period specific, but had you told me that was leather, I'd have been like, oh, so you're subtly hinting that this guy is underneath is very sick and twisted, because who wears a leather bow tie?
That's exactly it.
But tell me, are there any other clues that you had worked into how to define these characters through their costumes? I mean, I know, you've got the pastel colors for the white families of the Compton neighborhood. Those are kind of visually cueing them all together. But what about the Emery families? What costume choices did you make? Color choices did you make that helped define who they were as people?
Well, again, we all work so well together, I have to say, on this project. And we had a lot of discussions on how we wanted to present our sets, our actors in our sets, the characters. So the Emerys were, they're from the South. They lived on a farm. They were kind of grounded in it, and, we picked sort of earth tones for them. So, and so when they come into the neighborhood, again, he's in the brown suit. Again, you'll see brown is used in clothing throughout as well, because we're visually trying to show, people are fearing the color of their skin. So there's different times, like, Henry's suit that he wears through most of it is brown, this brown suit, which is like a suit of armor, and it's brown. So, like, when he goes into Tanner, most of the men are in, blues and lighter colors, and he's the only one in brown. So, and then when they came into the neighborhood, they had everybody their pastel houses, everyone's in their pastel dresses. And then the Emerys come in, they're sort of in these earth tones, and they get in front of their house. And again, you know, they when they go into their house, the wallpaper, everything's much more, you know, earthy and dark. And, you know, we played it throughout everything, you know, through the clothing and through the interior of the house. Whereas when you go into the other people's houses, the other homeowners, they're more pastels and lighter. So we carried that theme through to the clothes as much as we could. And so, you know, Lucky's in her green dresses. You know, she's in that green dress when she goes to the hardware store, and you know barely see Henry out of brown, really. You know, he's got, you know, a sport coat that's also brown with blue flecks. There's, you know, we tried to keep him in that world as well.
So you also have to outfit or design costumes for the supernatural characters. Let's call it that. I'm most interested in how you arrived on the designs for the tap dancing man. Were you looking at sort of period grotesque sort of iconography, you know, from the 20s, 30s, and 40s to design him?
Yeah, that was an interesting character because he came on mid through the project. I mean, I'm sure he was always there for obviously for little Marvin, but we didn't really start getting into it till closer to the time we needed to shoot him. And so it was kind of a process. Like, we did drawings, we did did a lot of research, we pulled clothes, and we had sort of the minstrel character, but we don't want it to be too minstrelly. Like, you know, what's the makeup going to be? And a lot of that was designed, I think, around 2 once we had our actor was cast. You know, really came together. So you had an idea that we wanted it to be minstrel, but we didn't want to go too far. He wasn't to be too raggedy. You know, the clothing is, some of it is sort of falling apart, but it's not like patchwork and, you know, cutesy. You know, I wanted something visually that could. This is another directive that we were working in, is that we wanted these characters to go in and out of the shadows. And so, you know, it's hard to, you know, black is the given. So we had to have something that that would also pop in each one of these characters. And for the tap dance man, his one outfit was that we loved the striped pants, which was an original pair of pants from the 1800s that was knit. Which was crazy. And we redid it because we needed to have multiples in it. But we really, like, for me, I really loved that black and white look, you know, and anytime you see him creeping out between the makeup and the pants and whatnot. And I thought it worked really well, and we were excited about it. And then they wanted to kind of blend into the band. So we made the band look when he's a tanner. And so he has a different outfit for that one episode. And he's got this, which is an original piece that was a, you know, sort of a reddish maroon coat that had stripes on it again, but they were sort of falling off. And we did multiply that jacket as well, not knowing what we were going to do with the finale. But it was a really interesting character to do, and I really feel it became all of us putting it together. And when we first saw Jeremiah come out with the makeup, we did the camera test. We all couldn't believe it. It was just so powerful, and it really, you know, his character was, you know, so powerful whenever he was on camera.
Absolutely. Just a product of such an extraordinary collaboration between you and the other departments making this show. Talking about challenges, you also had to costume for the episode Covenant 2, which is the black and white flashback episode. Talk to me about the challenges there in designing that period, because it is black and white. So I know all colors aren't necessarily going to render the same way that they do for a black and white cinematography that they would for color cinematography.
Well, we weren't sure if we were going to do black and white or color, so we sort of designed for both.
Okay.
So, you know, we chose a color palette that could go both ways. So, you know, so that they could, you know, figure out how they wanted to do it. So the most challenging part of that was that my assistant designer and I decided we didn't want it to be like a typical Western. It was supposed to be 1860s and it's a Western town. But then little Marvin was like, I just don't know, but I want it to be too Western. So we started to do research on, you know, different, you know, other, you know, immigrants that came from other countries at that time period. And we found the Dutch had come. And so, and it kind of played into, you know, in this area like Solvang and whatnot. And so we went full Dutch and we probably, you know, didn't realize how hard it was going to be. because they had all these amazing headpieces that they wore. And then you'll see these gold sort of, they look like aliens that hold the headpieces on the women. And we thought it would be really dramatic and kind of, you know, spooky and creepy, and yet beautiful at the same time, because they're so dramatic, these, you know, the headpieces. And even just how they wore their clothes. It was just so interesting and different. So it wouldn't be like a typical Western. And it really felt like we were somewhere else. And I think it really worked. It was very hard to do. We ended up we contacted somebody in, you know, in the Netherlands that was able to get us a lot of original pieces because of how they're starched and made. We couldn't really create it. You know, we did some, but most of it were original pieces from the 1800s. And it was really amazing to do, really hard to do, but very dramatic. And it didn't help the COVID hit right before we were supposed to shoot it. I had actually flown to New Mexico, fit a bunch of people there so that the crew there knew how to fit them. And we were starting into fittings. I came back and there was not a soul in the airport going there or coming back. And I went in and everybody was like concerned. We've got to send the crew there. We got to pack up everything. We got to get everything to New Mexico. And there was a real panic. And I just sat there and I was like, you know what, you guys, I don't think anyone's going anywhere. And sure enough, the next day we all shut down. And so that just sat there for all that time. So, you know, it was interesting to have to come back and to work with a costume that has to be put on a certain way. It was really hard to do the headpieces. It was a real challenge shooting that all of those costumes in COVID. We were one of the first shows back too. So half of it was done. I got contact traced at one point, and half of it was done from my hotel room, looking at my phone with a crew on set saying, "Button that shirt up," you know, unbutton that. You know. It was really interesting. So yeah.
So last question for you. What's your favorite look from the show?
Well, I mean, I love Tap Dance Man. There's so many. One of my favorite pieces is the brown dress that Lucky wears when she's coming through the neighborhood, and it's got trees on it that has pastels. All the trees are different colored pastels. And she goes up and she slaps Alison Peel's character. That dress gives me the shivers. We had to make it. We had to we printed the fabric and you know tweaked it a little bit, but it was an actual piece that we'd gotten from that time period. And I just love that it represented Lucky. You know, again, it was very brown, and then the neighborhood, you know, with all the pastel colors, like the neighborhood, kind of all the trees taking her over. Mm-hmm. And you know, and we liked the trees. We thought they were significant. You know, they're reminiscent of lynchings because we had the scenes before where all the dolls were hung up there. So we felt like it was like that world coming, you know, just taking her over. So that was a really favorite dress to us. There's a lot of symbolism in a lot of the clothes. I mean, it's the same. Gracie's got embroidery where there's like a lamb at the end, like, you know, we're sort of representing the Silence of the Lambs, and then she's got lavender on her collar that we embroidered on that dress that was, you know, about when their son had put, you know, she'd covered him in lavender to try and protect him. So, you know, I liked Lucky's dress. I liked Tap Dance Man. I liked the birdcage dress, which is what we called Allison's dress at the end, which had the lattice on it and the bird pin. And then there's another original print that we had found that was an angel, a black baby that is an angel that's on the cousin. Gosh, I can't remember her name. I don't know how that is. Hazel. That when she comes to the house and she's sort of taken over by a demon, her face starts to melt. The blouse is actually a black baby angel flying around on the shirt. So it's saying about, you know, what happened and you know, I showed that to little Marvin. I was like, this could be too much. I'm not sure, but it's so unusual that this was like a print that they used in the 40s. And so weird. And I kind of feel like it works in this because, again, it's a dream character coming out. So, you know, it's out of her mind, out of Lucky's mind. So there was a lot. It was a show rich in a lot of, there were so many places that we could really, you know, work with wardrobe in that way that you can't usually do in a lot of other projects. And, you know, everyone was in on it, from the cinematographer to the production designer, you know, and the actors. So it was probably one of my favorite projects to date that I've worked on.
Awesome. Just talking about it again makes me want to go back and sort of look at moments of this and try to pick out, the symbolism in the outfits, like you're talking about with the trees on that dress.
Yeah, and she's got a scarf that has feathers, and again, birds. The first scene we see her in, and she takes the scarf off as she goes into the house. So there's a lot everywhere we could do something that had sort of some meaning, and the actors even said it kind of helped them too. It gave them, it was such a subtle, like a poetry, and we had fun doing it. So on such a hard show, very difficult show to do. So
of course.